On base, the air carried that mixture of dust and steel that always clung to uniforms after a long day. I had just finished drills and my body ached in the familiar way that comes from discipline and routine. The barracks were quiet, and the echo of boots on concrete reminded me that this was supposed to be a place of order and control, a place where respect and rank defined every breath. I did not expect my family to intrude on that space, but when I turned the corner near the visitor area, I saw them. My brother David stood there with that smirk that had followed me since childhood. He was 30 now, taller than me, broader, but that grin was the same weapon he had used when we were children. Beside him stood my father, Colonel Richard Whitman, still in his pressed uniform, eyes hard and cold as stone. "Family visit," the guard said, as if this was normal, but nothing about this was normal. I had not asked them to come. I knew trouble had arrived the moment I saw David's hands shoved in his pockets like he owned the place. He stepped forward, blocking my path, and his voice dripped with entitlement. "You are still going to do it, Laura," he said. I frowned, sweat trickling down my neck. "Do what, David?" His grin widened. "Clean up after me, just like always. My boots are filthy, my gear is a mess, and since you are the family maid, you should take care of it." His words landed harder than the sun beating down on my face. I thought maybe he was joking, but his eyes held that sharp gleam of cruelty. My father crossed his arms, watching. He did not speak, not yet. I shook my head firmly. "No, I am not here for that. I am a soldier. I am not your servant." The refusal was simple one syllable, but in my family it was a declaration of war. David's expression twisted. He stepped closer until his shadow swallowed mine. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better. You think you can just walk away from who you are." He pushed his shoulder against mine. My father's silence pressed heavier than his weight. My heartbeat drummed in my ears. I knew what would follow, but I did not move. I would not bend. The moment cracked when David's hand slid behind him. He pulled the pistol at his hip not to fire, but to humiliate. Before I could step back, he swung it sideways and the butt slammed into my hand. The crack of bone meeting metal echoed against the barracks wall. Pain shot up my arm like fire ripping through my veins. My breath caught. I staggered but did not fall. I looked down and saw my hand already swelling, trembling, the skin splitting, blood spotting across my knuckles. David sneered. "That is what happens when you forget your place." I bit down against a cry. My knees wobbled, but I locked them in place. The world narrowed to the throbbing agony in my hand. The air seemed to vanish, and for a moment the base that had always been my refuge turned into a cage. My father finally stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost bored. "He is the son, Laura. Know your place." Those words were colder than the weapon. I lifted my eyes to him, searching for even the smallest trace of concern, but there was nothing. Just that stare that had commanded soldiers for decades. A stare that had once been my anchor, but was now my chain. Emotional undulations surged through me. Shock at the sudden violence, pain from the fracture burning under my skin, anger rising like a storm in my chest, and then something else, something sharper, steadier. Resolve. David expected me to collapse, to cry, to kneel. My father expected me to obey, to lower my gaze. Instead, I straightened my back, though every nerve screamed. I clenched my good hand into a fist at my side. "You will never own me." The words were not spoken aloud yet. They lived in my chest like a secret vow. I stared at them both. My brother with the weapon still dangling in his hand. My father with his arms folded in final judgment. The silence between us was louder than any command. I held their gaze, breathing through the agony, and I promised myself this would be the last time they ever laid a hand on me, the last time they would order me, the last time they would believe I existed only to serve. That vow pulsed stronger than the pain. It was a cliff-edge moment, the kind where life before and after splits apart. The base around us continued to hum with the ordinary rhythm of soldiers returning to their quarters. No one knew what had just taken place in the shadow of the visitor lot. No one knew that something inside me had broken, and at the same time, something stronger had been born. My father turned away as if the matter were settled. David tucked the pistol back into his belt smug, and certain that he had won. They thought the blow had silenced me. They thought the blood dripping from my fingers marked defeat. But they did not see the fire in my eyes. They did not see the way pain sharpened into purpose. They would learn. This was not the end. This was the beginning. When the pain in my hand pulsed, I found myself drifting back through years of memories because what happened on base was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the latest page in a book that had been writing itself since I was a child. In our home, David was never just my brother. He was the chosen one, the crown, the future. And me, I was the shadow that kept the house running, the one expected to absorb orders without question. I was 8 when I first realized my position. My mother, Margaret, stood in the kitchen, arms folded, and said words that branded themselves into my skin. "He is the boy. You serve him." At that age, I thought she meant something temporary, maybe a chore I could escape later. But it was doctrine repeated until it became scripture. David spilled juice on the carpet, and I was told to clean it. David failed a math test, and I was blamed for not helping him study. David stayed out late, and I was scolded for not reminding him of curfew. The roles were set, and the hierarchy was unshakable. My father, Richard, reinforced it with the precision of a colonel. "Discipline makes strength," he would say, staring at me like I was an insubordinate recruit rather than a daughter. When I asked questions, his glare could slice through bone. "You are not here to argue, Laura. You are here to contribute." That word contribute became a leash. It sounded noble, but it meant silence, obedience, sacrifice. My worth was measured by how much easier I made their lives, not by who I was or what I dreamed. Emotional undulation carried me between small bursts of hope and crushing waves of despair. I thought if I excelled in school, they would see me. When I brought home good grades, my father glanced once and then turned to David to ask about his soccer game. When I cooked dinner at 12, standing on a stool to reach the stove, my mother tasted it and said, "At least you are useful." Useful, not loved, not cherished, just useful. That word echoed through my teenage years like a drumbeat. David learned early that he could weaponize my obedience. He tossed his dirty clothes in my room because he knew I would wash them. He woke me at midnight demanding I iron his shirts because he had a date. He called me names, nothing clever, just sharp reminders that I was beneath him. And every time I looked for backup, my parents sided with him. He is the boy. You will understand when you are older. Older came, but understanding never did not in the way they meant. What I understood was the pattern, the architecture of control. My mother as the enforcer, cold and relentless. My father as the judge issuing verdicts without appeal. David as the crown entitled to everything, responsible for nothing. And me as the system, the engine that made the house appear perfect from the outside. Neighbors saw trimmed lawns, clean windows, ironed uniforms, and assumed my mother was diligent. They never noticed the girl in the background scrubbing, folding, memorizing grocery lists. I was invisible, and invisibility was the point. Inside me, a quiet rebellion flickered. I kept a notebook tucked into the lining of my backpack. At first, it held simple lists, what chores I did, what time I set the alarm so my father's coffee was hot at 0600. Then it became something more. A ledger. Every task, every sacrifice, every time David's mistakes were pinned on me. It was proof that usefulness was the only currency in our household, and I was the one being robbed. Emotional undulation again rose and fell. Some nights I cried into my pillow, certain I would disappear under the weight of it all. Other nights I whispered promises into the dark that one day they would regret treating me as nothing more than a servant. When I chose the military path at 19, it was supposed to be freedom. I thought if I wore the uniform, if I served the nation, they could no longer dismiss me as weak. But even that choice they twisted. My father boasted to his colleagues that discipline ran in the family. My mother said, "At least now you will learn how to serve properly." David laughed and told people I joined so I could iron more shirts. The escape I had dreamed of became another stage for their control. Every leave, every visit they pulled me back, demanding chores, demanding silence, reminding me that blood outranks any uniform. That is why what happened on base did not shock me as much as it should have. The violence was louder, yes, but the message was the same. You are nothing but a tool. You exist to serve him. Yet in that moment when pain screamed through my broken hand, I felt the shift. The script they had forced on me since childhood was breaking apart. They thought they were reaffirming control, but they had sharpened my resolve instead. The foundation of their toxic system was laid years ago, brick by brick of humiliation and command. But every brick they stacked had also built something inside me, a strength they had not anticipated. The family doctrine had trained me in silence, in endurance, in patience. They believed those were weaknesses. They were wrong. They were weapons waiting to be used not against me, but against them. And as I stood there in agony, my mind returned to every word my mother had spoken, every glare from my father, every smirk from David, and I knew the reckoning was coming. They had written the rules of my life, but I was about to rewrite them. The memories of daily oppression are not just fragments of the past, but a chain of moments that built the cage I lived in. When I try to explain it, I know outsiders might think it was simply chores or responsibilities every child faces. But the difference was not in the tasks themselves. It was in the weight and the imbalance in how everything in our household tilted toward David's comfort while crushing me under expectations I never agreed to. I was 11 when my mother told me to rewrite David's homework so it looked neat. He had spent the afternoon playing video games while I bent over his scribbles until midnight, my eyes blurring, my fingers cramping. The next morning, the teacher praised his improvement, and my parents congratulated him at dinner while I sat silent staring at the food that tasted like ash. No one looked at me. That invisibility was a constant companion. At 13, when David smashed a vase during one of his tantrums, I was the one scolded for not preventing it. My father's words still echo, "You should have been watching him." At 14, when David got into a fight and blood-stained his soccer uniform, I stayed up soaking it out of the fabric scrubbing until my knuckles were raw. He came by, grabbed the shirt, without thanks, and tossed another on the pile. The cycle repeated over and over. The more I did, the more they demanded. I folded his laundry-memorized grocery lists, ironed pleats, cooked meals, and none of it was seen as kindness. It was expected, like breathing, like oxygen. Emotional undulation twisted through me. Sometimes there was a flicker of pride when something sparkled under my hands when the house looked perfect. Maybe now they will see me, I thought. But praise never came, only more demands, more correction, more reminders that my worth was tied to usefulness. My mother used to tilt her head and say with a satisfied smile, "Girls keep the house running, that is just how it is." She quoted it like scripture. My father enforced it like law. David absorbed it like a crown prince who believed the universe revolved around him. I became not a daughter, not a sister, but staff, a maid without pay, without recognition. Even during military leave when other soldiers went home to warmth and celebration, I returned to chores. One summer, I arrived back after a long deployment, exhausted, hoping for rest. Instead, my mother handed me a list the moment I stepped through the door. David's car needed cleaning, his uniforms needed pressing, the garage was cluttered. I remember standing there with my duffel still slung over my shoulder, sweat drying on my back, and realizing they did not see me as a soldier who had served her country. They still saw me as the house servant. That realization burned deeper than the sun. I carried my secret notebook everywhere. At first, it was just survival, a way to prove to myself I was not imagining the imbalance. I wrote down the tasks in neat lines, each one a stroke of invisible ink that one day would become visible. Wake at 5 to start laundry. Iron 3 shirts for David. Clean bathroom after he left toothpaste smeared across the sink. Cook dinner for 4, though only 3 were thanked. Hide my own report card so his failures would not stand out. The list grew until the notebook felt heavy, even when it was empty of ink. Each entry whispered a truth they refused to acknowledge. I was carrying the weight of the family while being told I was worthless. Emotional undulation again swelled. Some days I collapsed into tears, my pillow muffling the sobs because even crying was treated as weakness, as drama. My mother would snap, "Stop being dramatic. No one will put up with that attitude in the real world." Other days I clenched my teeth and thought, "Let them underestimate me. Let them think I am weak." Because I was building something they could not see. My ledger was not just a diary. It was evidence, a record, a blueprint for resistance. Still, the labor ground me down. At 16, I wanted to join a school trip, but my father refused, saying, "Who will keep the house in order while you are gone?" At 17, when I earned a scholarship, he dismissed it, saying it was luck and that David deserved more support because he was the son. The injustice pressed harder than any belt or weapon. It was a suffocating weight that told me my dreams were irrelevant. Yet each injustice carved a scar that later became armor. By the time I joined the military at 19, I thought I had broken free, but even then the family system pulled me back. On phone calls, my mother demanded I send money home. My father reminded me that loyalty to family came before loyalty to command. David asked if I could get him discounts at the base exchange. I realized the cage traveled with me. The oppression was not confined to four walls. It lived in their voices, in their expectations, in the invisible leash they tried to keep wrapped around my neck. The more they pulled, the tighter my resolve became. Emotional undulations surged in me like tides. Waves of exhaustion and despair crashed hard, but always retreated, leaving behind a stronger shore. Every chore, every command, every belittling comment hardened my core. They thought they were breaking me down. They were training me, and one day I would turn that training against them. That day was closer than they imagined. The breaking point did not arrive in silence. It came with the sharp echo of metal against bone and the deafening quiet that followed. On base, I had always believed the rules of the military would shield me from the chaos of my family. Rank mattered here. Protocol mattered here. But as I stood clutching my fractured hand with blood streaking across my skin, I realized the fortress of order could be invaded by the old doctrine of my household. David still smirked as if he had scored a victory. My father still crossed his arms as if he had judged and sentenced me with one line. "He is the son, Laura. Know your place." My breath shuddered through clenched teeth. I wanted to scream, to curse, to call out the injustice, but instead I straightened my back, though the weight of agony pulled me down. Emotional undulations struck hard. Pain surged like lightning, humiliation flared like fire, but beneath it all, a colder current flowed resolve, sharp as glass. They thought this was another chapter in the same book of obedience. They thought I would lower my head and pick up the tasks again. They did not realize the book was about to close and a new one was being written. The confrontation stretched longer than the seconds it truly lasted. My father's gaze dared me to protest, his silence heavier than commands. David rolled his wrist to the pistol butt, gleaming faintly, a threat without words. I met their eyes, refusing to bow. My voice did not rise, but my stare was louder than shouting. Then I turned and walked away, every step vibrating with pain, every movement a declaration. Behind me, I heard my father exhale, as if dismissing a disobedient recruit, and David's mocking laugh echoing in the air. But I did not stop. I carried myself to the infirmary, jaw-tight, blood dripping from my knuckles. The medic looked alarmed, asked what happened. Training guided me to lie. "A fall," I said. "Just clumsy." Because admitting the truth meant exposing the rot of my family, and I was not ready to show the world yet. But as the bandage tightened around my hand and the medic scribbled notes, I studied my reflection in the metal cabinet. A soldier's uniform, bruises blossoming across my skin, and eyes that no longer belonged to someone willing to be broken. Flashbacks stormed through my mind. Every time my mother had said girls serve boys. Every glare from my father when I asked why. Every chore, every late night, every time I swallowed words until they curdled inside me. The breaking point was not just the swing of a weapon. It was the accumulation of years crashing into a single moment. Emotional undulation tore me open, grief for what I had endured, fury for what they still believed, and a strange exhilaration for the path that opened before me. I realized they had made a mistake. They had exposed themselves on base in the one place where rank and order were supposed to matter, where impartial eyes could witness if I chose to reveal the truth. They had assumed silence would keep me chained. They had not noticed that silence could also sharpen into a blade. Over the next days, I moved carefully, nursing my injured hand, performing duties with my left arm while my right throbbed. Each salute, each drill, each order reminded me of the structure of the military, of how accountability worked when not poisoned by favoritism. It was a stark contrast to my family system, where accountability was twisted into blame against me. I began to see the outlines of my plan. But first, the emotional turbulence raged. At night, I replayed the moment, the crack, the pain, the words. I clenched my teeth until my jaw ached. Sometimes tears slipped out when the dorm lights were low. Other times, I laughed bitterly at the absurdity a grown man 30 years old, still demanding his sister serve him, still backed by a father blind with pride. The laughter hurt more than the tears because it showed me how pathetic their throne was. They were royalty in a house of sand. The breaking point did not just fracture my hand. It fractured the illusion that they still owned me. I thought of other soldiers on base, men and women who carried their scars from combat, from training, from sacrifices for country. My scar was different, but no less defining. It was carved by the family that should have protected me. And instead of diminishing me, it now stood as proof that I had survived their attempts to reduce me to nothing. The next confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, my father called me into the visitor lounge. He sat stiffly, David lounging beside him, still smug. My father's voice was clipped. If you cannot obey family, Laura, how can you obey command? The words were meant to cut, meant to undermine me, but instead they revealed his blindness. He believed obedience to family was equal to obedience to the military. He did not see the difference between loyalty and servitude. My hand still in bandages, I stood tall. Emotional undulations swelled, pain rising with anger, but my tone stayed calm. I serve my country. That is not the same as serving David. For the first time, David's smirk faltered. My father's eyes narrowed, but he did not shout. He leaned forward, voice sharp. Blood comes before everything. Without family, you are nothing. His words tried to drag me back into the cage, but I was no longer inside. I felt the bars shatter with every beat of my heart. I said nothing further, only held his gaze, then turned and walked out again. Each step echoed a truth. This was the last time they would command me, the last time they would strike me without consequence, the last time they would believe I was bound to them by chains of obedience. They had drawn the line. I was crossing it. Emotional undulation reached its peak agony and liberation colliding. The breaking point on base was not only the moment my hand was smashed, it was the recognition that the rules of my family no longer governed me. From that fracture rose a soldier not just in uniform but in spirit, prepared to fight not for their approval but for her own freedom. And once that realization rooted in me, there was no turning back. In the stillness of the infirmary at night, when most soldiers slept and the halls echoed only with the distant hum of generators, I faced the reflection that had become my mirror of truth. My injured hand was wrapped in white bandages, thick and heavy. But what struck me more was not the physical wound. It was the clarity in my eyes, sharp, unflinching, a clarity I had not seen before. I had endured countless commands and humiliations throughout my life, but now the truth glared back at me from the glass. They had not broken me. They had trained me. That realization arrived like a whisper, at first almost unbelievable, but then it grew louder until it filled every corner of my chest. My mother's voice had always haunted me. You are a girl. Your worth is service. My father's tone had been a constant reminder, you are here to contribute. And David's smirk had echoed, you will never leave. For years, I believed those lines were chains. They pressed against my skin, forced me to bend. But standing there, I realized they had given me something else, skills they did not understand. They taught me endurance by overloading me with endless chores. They taught me silence by ignoring my protests. They taught me precision by demanding perfection in every task. They believed they were molding a servant, but in truth, they were forging a soldier who knew how to observe record and bide her time. Emotional undulations surged as memories collided with revelation. I felt sorrow for the girl who cried alone at night, fury at the parents who never saw her worth, but also a strange thrill, a pulse of empowerment, because now I saw the pattern. They had handed me the tools of their own downfall. My notebook, once a secret lifeline, now became a weapon in my mind. Every entry, every task written down was evidence not just of labor, but of exploitation. My scars, once marks of shame, were proof of survival. The swelling in my hand was not only injury, it was a banner of defiance. As I traced the edges of my bandage, I whispered to myself words that burned like fire. They did not break me, they trained me, and I will use everything they gave me against them. The echo of that vow steadied my breathing. Emotional undulation dipped into grief as I remembered moments I had once cherished. My father teaching me how to tie boots when I was a child, my mother brushing my hair for school, David holding my bike steady when I was small. Were those memories lies, or had they been eclipsed by the years of cruelty that followed? A pang of loss stabbed me, but I refused to let it soften my resolve. The revelation was not about rewriting the past to make it gentler. It was about seeing the truth with unclouded eyes. They had chosen their path, and so would I. In the days that followed, I walked across base with new posture. My fellow soldiers noticed. One asked if I was all right. I nodded, hiding the storm that brewed inside. Outwardly, I remained disciplined, but inwardly, my mind turned every moment into strategy. I reviewed the ledger in my thoughts, recalling each recorded injustice, and I began to imagine how those records could be revealed when the time came. I studied the regulations of military conduct, noting how officers could be held accountable, how evidence could be submitted. My father had always assumed his rank protected him. David had always assumed family bonds silenced me. They underestimated the power of documentation, the strength of truth, when exposed in the right light. Emotional undulation carried me again into doubt. What if no one believed me? What if the system failed me as my family had? Fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. But then I remembered Sarah Miller, the lieutenant, who had once told me rules mean something here. You just have to use them right. That memory steadied me. I would not be fighting alone forever. My resolve crystallized further one evening when my mother called. Her voice slid through the phone, cold and certain. You are embarrassing us, Laura. You will apologize to your brother. Without us, you are nothing. The words that had once sent me into spirals of guilt now only hardened me. I listened in silence, then ended the call without a reply. My heart raced, my hand ached, but inside I felt unshaken. That was the moment I knew the leash had snapped. Revelation transformed into action. I began scanning the bruises, photographing the swelling before the bandages were changed. I kept digital copies hidden just in case. I spoke less, listened more, noting every slip of arrogance from David, every veiled threat from my father. The pattern was not only clear, it was predictable. They believed they had silenced me, but they had trained me to gather, to observe, to prepare. Emotional undulation soared when I realized how much strength lay in patience. Every day I walked past my father on base, his uniform pristine, his authority unchallenged, but in my pocket rested the weight of truth waiting to be unveiled. Every night I returned to my notebook, updating, refining, shaping my evidence into something undeniable. I whispered my vow before sleep. They did not break me. They trained me, and now I am ready. That mantra replaced the old poison of their words. No longer was I worthless. No longer was I bound to serve. I was a soldier with a mission, and the battlefield was not foreign soil, but the toxic empire of my own family. From revelation came power. From power came resolve. And from resolve would come justice. The beginning of resistance did not arrive with loud declarations or open defiance. It arrived in silence, in the careful way I placed my phone on the nightstand and angled the lens to catch reflections, in the way I pressed record before stepping into the room where my father waited, in the way I turned pain into data. Silence was no longer their weapon against me. It was mine. My hand still throbbed beneath the bandages, but I had learned how to steady it enough to write. Every day I added lines to the ledger dates and times, the exact words they hurled at me, the tasks they demanded, the bruises that bloomed. I gave each entry precision like a soldier's report. They thought obedience meant I had stopped fighting, but in truth, I was building a case more powerful than any shouted protest. Emotional undulation carried me between fear and determination. Fear whispered that if they discovered my notes or recordings, they would find new ways to break me. Determination answered that I had already survived worse. Each time I placed pen to paper, I felt the balance shift slightly in my favor. The silence that once suffocated me now strengthened me. The first test came when David barged into my quarters during a weekend visit. He demanded I drive him into town, that I clean his boots, that I pack food for him. My hand ached, but I held my phone in my pocket thumb, pressing record. He ranted for 10 minutes about how I owed him loyalty, how sisters existed to serve brothers. My stomach churned, but I kept my expression neutral. Later, I replayed the audio and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Evidence. Proof that his arrogance was not just my memory, but reality captured in his own words. That night, I scanned the bruises left by his shove against the door frame, each image stored in a hidden folder, each file a bullet in the chamber of my silent war. Emotional undulation dipped when guilt pricked me. Part of me still longed for a mother's embrace, a father's approval, a brother's laughter. I stared at old photos of us as children and wondered if I was betraying them by preparing this arsenal. But then I remembered the pistol butt slamming into my hand, my father's voice telling me to know my place, my mother's words insisting my worth was service. The guilt burned away, replaced by clarity. Protecting them meant destroying myself. Choosing myself meant exposing them. The decision had already been made the moment they chose violence. Silence became routine. I spoke little at meals. I stopped defending myself when accusations flew. Instead, I listened, recorded, stored. The more they underestimated me, the more careless they became. My father ordered me to complete paperwork for him, tasks he should have handled as an officer, and when he barked his commands, I wrote down the details, noting how he abused his authority. David raged about debts and demanded money. I traced every transaction, every text. My mother muttered cruel lines about how daughters were burdens. I memorized them like scripture twisted into ammunition. The resistance was not only about collecting evidence, it was about reshaping my own mind. For years, their voices had been the loudest in my head. Now I drowned them with my own. At night, I whispered affirmations. You are not their servant. You are not worthless. You are a soldier. You are strong. Each repetition stitched my fractured self together. Still, emotional undulation persisted. Some nights I woke drenched in sweat, heart-pounding nightmares of David's sneer chasing me. Other mornings I rose with steel in my spine, ready to continue the quiet work. Hope and dread battled inside me, but neither won. Instead, they fused into a rhythm that kept me sharp. The turning point of my silent resistance came when Lieutenant Sarah Miller noticed my bandaged hand and asked quietly what had happened. For a moment, I considered lying again, saying it was training, but something in her eyes told me she would believe the truth. I whispered, "It was my brother." She did not gasp or pity. She nodded and said, "Start documenting everything. Use the rules." That validation hit me harder than I expected. Someone believed me without question. Someone offered a strategy instead of dismissal. From then on, Sarah became my quiet ally. She explained procedures for reporting misconduct, for preserving evidence, for safeguarding files. She reminded me that silence could be strategic, but also that eventually I would need to step into the open. Emotional undulation soared with relief, then crashed with fear. Relief that I was not alone. Fear of the storm that would follow exposure. But even fear tasted different now. It tasted like fuel. Together, we practiced scenarios. What to say if questioned, how to frame my evidence, when to move and when to wait. It was a kind of training parallel to drills on base, except this battle was not against foreign enemies, but against the toxic empire of my own blood. Every encounter with my family became reconnaissance. Every insult, every demand, every strike of my father's glare was logged. They thought they were maintaining control. In reality, they were building their own downfall with each careless word. The more I collected, the stronger I felt. My silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy. Emotional undulation reached new peaks. Some days I wanted to throw the evidence in their faces immediately to scream and expose them. Other days I trembled with doubt, wondering if anyone outside would care. But Sarah's steady presence reminded me patience wins wars. I kept going. Weeks passed and my folders grew thick with proof. Photos, audio files, notes, bank statements, chore lists. My ledger expanded into a chronicle of servitude turned rebellion. Each entry a seed of justice waiting to bloom. And as I looked at the growing arsenal, I knew the time would come soon when silence would transform into thunder. For now, though, I remained in the shadows, smiling faintly when my father boasted, smirking inwardly when David demanded, steadying myself when my mother sneered. They believed the old system held. They did not see the cracks spreading beneath their feet. Silent resistance had begun. The decision to walk out did not come with a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, like the steady resolve that builds after years of storms. I had been gathering evidence, storing every insult, every bruise, every demand, but resistance in secret was not enough. To reclaim myself, I had to leave the house that still clung to me like chains every time I stepped through its door. I returned home one weekend on leave, and the moment I crossed the threshold, the familiar script began. David tossed his jacket at me and told me to hang it. My mother muttered that dinner was late. My father asked if I had prepared his uniform for a ceremony. My bandaged hand still ached, yet none of them saw me. They only saw the servant they believed I was born to be. Emotional undulation surged, frustration pressing hard against the walls of my chest, sorrow threatening to drown me, then clarity cutting through like a blade. This would be the last time. That night, I packed what little belonged to me, not in a suitcase, but in a simple backpack. A few clothes, my notebook ledger, the drive where my files were hidden, nothing more. I did not want weight. I wanted freedom. At midnight, I walked down the hallway one last time. My mother's door creaked open and she hissed, "Where are you going? Without us, you are nothing." Her words might once have shattered me. Now they bounced off armor forged in pain. I said nothing, just kept walking. Emotional undulation twisted my heart, aching for the daughter who had once begged for affection, but my spirit soaring with the knowledge that I was finally choosing myself. I left without slamming the door. Silence would be louder than rage. The night air was cool against my face, carrying scents of grass and distant asphalt. Each step away from that house felt like unshackling, yet fear followed close behind. What if I could not survive without them? What if I was truly nothing without their system? Doubt gnawed at me until I reached the small apartment of Lieutenant Sarah Miller. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with a swollen hand and tired eyes, she did not ask questions. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." Emotional undulation swung upward, relief flooding me so hard my knees nearly buckled. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Sarah gave me a blanket, cleared a corner of her spare room, placed a second-hand dresser by the wall. It was not much, but it was mine. That night, I lay on the thin mattress listening to the hum of the city beyond the window. No one barked orders. No one demanded silence. No one treated me as invisible. My ribs still throbbed, my hand still ached, but my soul exhaled for the first time. The following days were filled with small revelations. Sarah's group of fellow officers welcomed me with nods and laughter. They did not treat me as a burden. They invited me to meals, asked about my thoughts, respected my silence when I had none. Emotional undulation dipped as guilt returned a whisper that I had abandoned my family, that maybe I was betraying them. But then Sarah reminded me, family is not defined by blood, it is defined by respect. Those words pierced deep. I realized chosen family could replace toxic ties. Each dinner shared in Sarah's kitchen was a balm. Each late-night talk about strategy was a lesson in trust. I began to rebuild myself piece by fragile piece. Meanwhile, the phone calls started. My mother's voice, sharp as ever. "Without us, you are nothing. Come home and apologize." My father's tone clipped. "This is childish, Laura. No one will tolerate your behavior in the real world." David's sneer filtered through text messages mocking me, demanding I return to clean up his messes. Emotional undulation surged downward, fear and anger swirling, but then steadied as I ignored them. For the first time, I let silence be my answer. I did not argue. I did not beg. I simply blocked numbers, saved messages as further proof, and carried on. The absence of response enraged them more than any words could have. I heard through Sarah's network that David stormed through town complaining. My father snapped at colleagues late to work, distracted. My mother asked neighbors for help with meals, claiming illness. Their system was already straining without me, and I had only just begun to walk away. Emotional undulation soared high with satisfaction, then dipped as loneliness crept in at night. I missed the illusion of family, even if it was toxic. But I reminded myself that illusions cannot feed the soul. Only truth can. And the truth was simple. I was stronger away from them. My walkout was not only physical, it was emotional, spiritual, the severing of ties that had bound me since childhood. In the embrace of chosen family, I found not just shelter, but strength. Sarah encouraged me to continue documenting. She introduced me to contacts who understood military law. I began to see the path forming ahead, one that would lead not only to my survival, but to justice. Leaving the Whitman house was the bravest step I had ever taken, but it was only the beginning. The walkout had planted me in new soil, and with chosen family beside me, I would grow roots stronger than any chain they tried to wrap around me. The collapse did not happen all at once. It began with cracks small and almost invisible, like the first splinters in glass that soon spiderweb until the whole pane shatters. From the safety of Sarah's apartment, I watched those cracks spread across the Whitman household each day, a new fracture. Emotional undulation guided me through waves of grim satisfaction and moments of aching disbelief. For so long, I had believed they were untouchable, a fortress of control and authority. To see that fortress crumble without my presence felt surreal. The first sign came from David. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned he had been seen dragging a trash bag of clothes to the laundromat. For years, I had been the invisible hand scrubbing stains, ironing shirts, folding neatly. Without me, his appearance quickly deteriorated. He showed up to gatherings, disheveled buttons, mismatched stains on collars. At first, people whispered lightly, but whispers in small towns and tight military communities travel fast. Soon, his reputation as the Golden Son cracked, revealing laziness and entitlement underneath. Emotional undulation swelled a surge of vindication, but then dipped with sadness as I realized he had learned nothing. He was only angry that the servant was gone. My father's collapse came next. Colonel Richard Whitman prided himself on discipline and punctuality, but without me silently smoothing the edges of his routines, he began slipping. He forgot papers, showed up late, snapped at subordinates. Rumors reached me through Sarah's channels that HR had reprimanded him after an outburst during a staff meeting. The man who once stood as unshakable authority now faltered, his cracks exposed to the same military system he had used to intimidate me. Emotional undulation struck again, fury at the years he had crushed me under the word contribute. Then satisfaction as the same system demanded accountability from him. Margaret, my mother, showed her collapse in different ways. She had always been the enforcer, the voice repeating girls serve boys. But when I left, she faced the reality of a house without its hidden labor. Neighbors reported she looked exhausted, asking for help with groceries, complaining of back pain. She joined an online support group for parents who called their children ungrateful. Reading her posts through screenshots shared by a friend nearly made me laugh. She wrote of betrayal, of sacrifice of children who forgot who fed them. Not once did she mention the endless chores, the servitude, the bruises, the silenced tears. She twisted the story to cast herself as victim, yet the collapse was visible between the lines. Emotional undulation tugged me toward pity, but I resisted. She had chosen her role, and her collapse was the consequence. Their attempts to pull me back grew more desperate. Texts escalated. My mother pleaded. My father demanded. David mocked. "Come home, Laura. You need to stop this nonsense. This is childish. No one will accept you without us. You will apologize and earn your place again." Each message was a shard of the old cage trying to cut me. But I had armor now. I screenshotted each one, stored them in the growing archive. Proof not of love, but of manipulation. Proof that leaving had been necessary. Emotional undulation rose high with empowerment as I watched their desperation mount, then dipped low as loneliness whispered late at night. I had walked out, yes, but sometimes I wondered if the cost was too high. Yet every time I doubted, I recalled the sound of bone cracking under a pistol butt, the command to know my place, and the doubt burned away. The collapse became public when David failed to pay debts. Without me covering for him, without me smoothing his excuses, creditors came knocking. He shouted in the streets demanding help, but few listened. My father's colleagues distanced themselves after more incidents of temper. Whispers of investigation surfaced. My mother stopped appearing at church gatherings. The family that once looked polished and perfect now looked fractured and weak. I did not need to raise my voice. Their own actions spoke louder than anything I could say. Emotional undulations surged with a bittersweet taste. Triumph because justice was unfolding without me lifting a finger. Bitterness because part of me had wished they would realize the truth, apologize, change. But they never did. They only collapsed inward, consumed by anger at the vacuum I left. In Sarah's apartment, I lit a candle on Friday evenings. Not for prayer, not for memory, but as a ritual of independence. Each flame reminded me that peace could exist outside of their system. Each flicker contrasted with the chaos consuming their home. The more they collapsed, the steadier I became. And yet emotional undulation still played its cruel game. Some mornings I woke shaking, hearing echoes of my father's voice, my mother's commands, David's mockery. Other mornings I woke strong, filled with quiet determination to see this through. Collapse was not yet complete. It was only the beginning. The final blow would come when silence sharpened into exposure. Until then, I watched from a distance, each update a reminder that the structure of control they built for decades had been balanced entirely on my shoulders. Without me, it could not stand. They trained me to serve. By walking away, I let them collapse without me. Revenge did not arrive with shouting or fists. It arrived in the same way I had survived for years, with patience, precision, and silence, sharpened into something unbreakable. I had been gathering evidence like a soldier stockpiling ammunition, and now the arsenal was complete. The collapse of my family had already begun, but exposure would ensure there was no recovery, no way for them to rebuild their throne of control. Emotional undulation surged as I prepared waves of dread colliding with waves of exhilaration. I feared what would happen when I stepped into the light, but I also longed for the release the moment the world would finally see the truth that had lived in my notebook for years. It started with the box. Inside, I placed photocopies of every chore list my mother taped to the fridge lists where my name appeared again and again while David's remained absent. I added screenshots of text messages where my father demanded obedience and David sneered about my role. I included photographs of bruises, recordings of insults, scans of bills I had paid to cover David's debts. And finally, I printed the ledger, bound it into a thick document titled in bold letters, Unpaid Labor Years 10 to 27. On the cover, I wrote only my name, Captain Laura Whitman, because this time they would see me. I sealed the box and mailed it directly to the military tribunal, the council responsible for investigating misconduct within the ranks. My father's rank had shielded him for years, but against documented evidence even he could not hide. Emotional undulation dipped low with fear as I dropped the package. My hands trembling, sweat slicking my palms. What if they ignored it? What if the system failed me as my family had? But then I remembered Sarah's words. Rules mean something here. I clung to that hope. Weeks later, the tribunal summoned me to provide testimony. I walked into the stark white room, my uniform pressed my heart pounding. Across the table sat officers who studied me with calm eyes. I laid out my evidence piece by piece, my voice steady even as my stomach knotted. I described years of servitude disguised as family duty, the violence on base, the command to know my place. For the first time, people in authority listened. They asked questions, took notes, examined documents. They did not dismiss me. Emotional undulation surged upward relief so intense it nearly brought tears, then crashed downward when I thought of my parents reading the same files, their shame unfolding page by page. The investigation spread quickly. My father's colleagues whispered soldiers who had once saluted him now watched with suspicion. David's behavior came under scrutiny when recordings revealed his demands, his arrogance, his violence. My mother's words echoed through audio files, cruel lines preserved forever. The fortress of denial cracked wide open. The climax came at the veterans' gathering where Sarah had arranged for a journalist to attend. My evidence was presented not just behind closed doors, but projected on a screen before a hall of witnesses. The audience gasped when they heard David's voice sneering, "Sisters exist to serve brothers." They murmured in anger when they read my father's texts demanding obedience at any cost. Some even wept when they saw the ledger page after page of a young woman's life reduced to labor her worth measured only by chores completed. Emotional undulation reached its peak. Fury filled the hall, sympathy swelled toward me, and for the first time the shame that had always weighed me down shifted onto the shoulders of those who deserved it. David tried to shout claiming lies, claiming exaggeration, but the recordings silenced him. His own words condemned him. My father attempted to invoke rank, reminding them of his years of service, but the tribunal declared that service does not excuse abuse. He was stripped of command, suspended pending further investigation. My mother stayed silent, her face pale, realizing her role as enforcer had been exposed too. The aftermath unfolded quickly. David was arrested for assault charged not only with the attack on base, but also with documented financial fraud. My father faced demotion, a career ending in disgrace. My mother found herself isolated, her support group mocking her once the truth became public. Emotional undulation swirled, part of me trembling with the enormity of what I had done, part of me soaring with the justice I had dreamed of for years. Cold revenge had been delivered not with screams, but with silence, made visible with documents, with evidence, with truth. That was the twist they had never seen coming. They had trained me to be silent, but I had turned silence into a blade. I did not gloat. I did not scream victory. I simply stood in that hall, back straight hand, still scarred, and let the evidence speak. When reporters asked how I felt, I answered with a calm voice. They taught me obedience. I chose justice. The headline the next day read, "Captain exposes family abuse with ledger of silence." Strangers reached out, some sharing their own stories of toxic households, others thanking me for my courage. Emotional undulation swelled with connection, then dipped with sorrow at how many had suffered like me. My revenge was not only for myself, it was a mirror held to every system that exploited silence. The Whitman family had collapsed completely. David behind bars, Richard disgraced, Margaret abandoned, and I, once the invisible daughter, now stood in the open, not just surviving, but fighting. Cold public revenge was complete. After the tribunal, after the headlines, after the collapse of everything they had once used to control me, life became strangely quiet. At first, that quiet unnerved me. For years, I had been conditioned to expect demands shouted from another room, to brace for footsteps in the hallway, to anticipate my name being called not as affection, but as a summons. Now the silence stretched across my days like an open field. Emotional undulation carried me between unease and relief. Unease because silence had once been their weapon. Relief because now silence belonged to me. I rented a small apartment near the base, a studio with one window that overlooked a narrow street. The floor creaked, the plumbing sputtered, but every inch was mine. I unpacked carefully, folding clothes into drawers, lining books on a shelf, placing my notebook ledger not under a mattress in fear, but openly on the desk as a relic of survival. For the first time in my life, I arranged my space without waiting for someone else's approval. The emotional swing tilted toward peace. Some evenings, I lit a candle on the windowsill. The flame flickered against the glass, soft light warming the walls. I told myself it was not for memory, not for mourning, but for celebration. Each flame marked another week of freedom, another week of no one demanding, no one demeaning, no one reducing me to labor. I began to sleep deeper, nightmares fading, though sometimes the echoes of my father's voice or the crack of the pistol butt would return. When they did, I woke with sweat on my skin, but I no longer trembled with fear. Instead, I whispered, "You cannot touch me anymore," and the darkness receded. My military career continued. In fact, it flourished. My testimony, my courage, the precision of my documentation, all of it impressed the tribunal. They recommended me for promotion, and within months I advanced in rank. Fellow officers saluted me with respect not only for my service, but for my resilience. Emotional undulation lifted me high with pride, but also humbled me because I knew countless others had suffered in silence without recognition. I dedicated myself to making sure their voices would not remain unheard. With Sarah's help, I began mentoring younger soldiers, especially women who felt overlooked or pressured. I told them my story not in every detail, but in enough to show that silence could be turned into strength. I encouraged them to document, to trust evidence, to value their own worth beyond obedience. Watching them stand taller reminded me that my rebirth was not only personal, but communal. Meanwhile, my family faded into background noise. David remained in custody awaiting sentencing. Reports said he was bitter, blaming everyone but himself. My father lived in disgrace, his uniform stripped of honor, his name whispered not with respect, but with caution. My mother remained in her echo chamber, claiming betrayal, but fewer listened now. Their empire of control had disintegrated into rubble, and I felt no urge to rebuild it. Emotional undulation dipped occasionally when memories of childhood surfaced moments, when my father once lifted me onto his shoulders, when my mother sang softly, when David laughed beside me before entitlement consumed him. Those memories hurt, but I accepted them as fragments of a life that could not outweigh the years of abuse. I did not need to erase them, only to acknowledge them and move forward. Healing was not forgetting. Healing was reclaiming. My hand remained scarred, the fracture healed but the mark visible. At first, I hated the sight, a constant reminder of pain. But over time, I came to see it differently. It was not just a scar. It was a testament, a banner of survival proof that even when they tried to shatter me, I had endured. Each time I saluted with that hand, I felt strength surge through me. The rebirth of my life was marked not by fireworks or dramatic proclamations, but by ordinary mornings. Waking up to quiet, cooking breakfast for myself alone, walking to duty with head high, folding laundry that belonged only to me. Each small act was revolutionary compared to the years when everything I did was for them. Ordinary became sacred. The resolution also meant releasing the need for their apology. For so long, I had dreamed that one day my father would say he was wrong. My mother would admit the cruelty, my brother would apologize for the violence. That day never came, and I realized it did not matter. My healing was not contingent on their remorse. It was built on my decision to leave, to expose, to rebuild. They could rot in denial. I would live in truth. Emotional undulation leveled into calm waves, less violent, more steady. I still felt the highs of triumph when I saw new soldiers look at me with respect, the lows of grief when loneliness crept in, but the extremes softened. Life no longer felt like a storm. It felt like a river flowing forward. One evening, months later, I visited the old neighborhood. I did not plan it. I was simply passing through. I slowed near the Whitman house but did not stop. The lawn was overgrown windows, smudged paint peeling. The house looked nothing like the pristine facade it once had. I imagined them inside, facing the void I had left, struggling to keep order without the backbone they had exploited. I felt no urge to knock, no urge to shout, no urge to prove anything. I simply kept walking, keys in my pocket, groceries in my hand. They had called me worthless, and I had given them exactly that. Nothing. No scream, no plea, no moment of my new life. They trained me to serve, but I chose to let them collapse without me. They believed silence meant submission, but I had made silence into their sentence. Emotional undulation reached its final arc in that moment. No rage, no sorrow, just peace. The rebirth of Captain Laura Whitman was complete. I was no longer the invisible daughter, no longer the servant. I was a soldier, a survivor, and most importantly, a free woman. If you have listened to my story until the very end, I want to pause now and ask you something directly. Have you ever felt invisible inside your own family? Have you ever been told that your worth depended on what you could do for others rather than who you are? For years, I lived under those words, those commands, those cruel reminders that service meant servitude and silence meant survival. My scars are real, my memories heavy, but so is the peace I found when I finally chose to walk away. I share this not only as a testimony of what I endured, but as an invitation to you, the one listening right now. Think about your own life. Think about the times when you were told to know your place, to stay quiet, to keep the peace, even when it cost you your dignity. Maybe it was a parent, maybe a spouse, maybe a sibling, maybe even a community that treated you as less. How many times did you swallow words you wanted to scream? How many nights did you lie awake wondering if you mattered? Emotional undulation is not only in the story I told, but in the story you live. The highs of small victories, the lows of crushing silence, the waves of doubt and strength that keep rising and falling. I know many of you, especially those over 50, carry decades of memories that are not always shared. Perhaps you grew up in households where children were told not to question, where girls were expected to serve brothers, where sons carried burdens they never asked for, where worth was measured in sacrifice. And maybe you never had the chance to speak it aloud. So let me say this to you now. You are not worthless. You are not invisible. You are not defined by what they demanded of you. You are defined by what you chose to endure, by what you survived, by the strength that still beats in your chest, even if you sometimes doubt it. I learned the hardest way that waiting for an apology from those who harm you is like waiting for rain in the desert. It may never come, and that is not your failure. That is their choice. My healing began when I stopped waiting for them to see me and decided to see myself. And I want you to think about that in your own life. Are you still waiting for someone else to acknowledge your worth? Are you still hoping for validation from the very people who cut you down? If so, let my story be a mirror and a call to action. Do not waste another year waiting for what may never arrive. Instead, begin writing your own ledger, not of chores or abuses, but of the truth of who you are and what you deserve. Emotional undulation rises as I say this because I know it hurts to face the reality that the family we were born into might never change. It hurts to admit that the people who should have loved us the most sometimes became the ones who wounded us the deepest. But then comes the turn, the upward swing. The promise that life after the break can be fuller, freer, and more peaceful than you imagine. When I walked out of that house and into Sarah's apartment, when I laid my head on a mattress that was mine alone, I discovered a freedom that outshone every memory of servitude. And I want you to imagine what your version of that walkout could be. Maybe it is not leaving a house, but setting a boundary, saying no when you once said yes, refusing to answer a call that only brings you pain. Maybe it is choosing to spend holidays with people who make you laugh instead of people who make you cry. Maybe it is daring to take a class travel or simply light a candle in a quiet room because you want to, not because anyone demanded it. These acts may seem small, but they are revolutionary when you come from a life of control. To my audience, many of you in your 50s, 60s, 70s, I know you have lived through eras where silence was expected, where speaking out was considered rebellion, where family reputation mattered more than individual truth. I honor your endurance, but I also challenge you now. Do not let the remainder of your life be governed by the same chains. You have survived enough storms. You deserve peace. You deserve dignity. You deserve joy. And it is never too late to claim it. Emotional undulation dips here because I know some of you listening may feel trapped, may feel it is too late, may fear the backlash of walking away. I felt the same. I feared I would collapse without them. But the twist, the unexpected truth is that they collapsed without me. They had built their kingdom on my back, and when I stepped away, the weight crushed them instead. You may not realize how much strength you already carry, how many systems would fall apart without you. Sometimes the bravest act is to let them fall. Now I want to invite you into this conversation. Share in the comments below if you have ever faced toxic control, if you have ever chosen silence because you felt you had no other choice. Share if you have walked away or if you dream of walking away. Share if you have found chosen family who gave you the love your blood family denied. These comments are not just words, they are lifelines. They are proof to others listening that they are not alone. Our generation, our community needs to hear it. Stories heal when they are spoken, and if you are someone who has never endured this kind of pain, listen anyway, because someone you love may be carrying it in silence, and your empathy might be the bridge they need to cross into freedom. I do not ask you to share for me. I ask you to share for yourself, for the person beside you, for the stranger who might read your words and finally believe they are not crazy, not weak, not alone. Emotional undulation rises again as I say this because it is not only about my story, it is about turning pain into power, silence into solidarity, scars into signals of survival. Each of you has a flame, even if it flickers weakly right now. Protect it, feed it, let it grow. And if you feel compelled, light a candle tonight as I do every Friday. Not for mourning, but for freedom. Let that flame remind you that peace is possible, that silence can be yours not as a punishment, but as a sanctuary. Let it remind you that every step away from those who diminish you is a step toward rebirth. Before I close, let me thank you for listening, for giving me your time, for allowing my voice into your space. If this story moved you, if it resonated with your past, please subscribe, please share, please comment. This channel exists to tell the stories that many are too afraid to tell. By supporting it, you are not only supporting me, you are amplifying the truth of countless others. I know the internet is full of noise, full of distraction, but I promise you here, we will keep speaking what others try to silence. So now I ask one final time. What about you? What silence have you endured? What strength have you hidden? What peace are you ready to claim? Leave your answer below. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what your candle represents. Let us build not just an audience, but a community where no one is invisible, where every story has value, where rebirth is not just mine, but ours. Remember, they may have called you worthless, but your worth cannot be erased. They may have tried to break you, but surviving is already proof of your strength. And the sweetest revenge is not fire, not fury, but footsteps walking away and never returning. That is what I gave them. That is what you can give to those who tried to chain you. Peace louder than pain. Freedom louder than fear. Silence louder than their control.